In quiet Olmsted Township, the air sits still over the water. Glass smooth, reflecting a pale Ohio sky that can't quite make up its mind between winter and spring. It's the kind of morning where you hear everything. The faint hiss of a passing car, a dog's bark 2 streets over, the whisper of reeds against the shore. Then, one sound you cannot unhear. A shout, a call for someone, for help, for the police. The pond doesn't give up its secrets willingly. It never does. But that morning, the water changes. It puckers around the blunt shape of a concrete block, a man-made weight made for anchoring something that was never meant to float back up. Ropes, knots, a shape no one wants to recognize but cannot deny, the unthinkable emerging from still water. They don't say a name at first, not out loud. The officers keep their voices low, their radios clipped and clinical. Neighbors gather at the edges of the tape, pulling their jackets tight, trying to understand how this kind of story has found its way to their quiet street. Someone whispers, "They found someone." Another person answers without meaning to. "Who?" Before the name, there was a question, and before the question, there was an absence. 3 months of absence. A room left as it was, a phone gone silent, a handful of messages drifting farther down a timeline no one wanted to scroll. A family's voice growing hoarse from repeating the same sentence to anyone who would listen. "She's missing. She didn't just leave. Please help us find her. Her name is Semia. To many who loved her, she is CeCe. She is 20. She is all the things 20 holds. Plans, noise, more laughter than money, a smile that keeps finding the light. She moves through a city that can be both cruel and kind, looking for a space where she can be fully seen. She deserves an ordinary tomorrow. She doesn't get it. The pond receives her in winter and attempts to keep her. But silence is a brittle thing. Under the surface, even the quiet remembers. The concrete remembers the hands that tied the knots. The reeds remember the night the water shivered with a splash that wasn't a fish. The shore remembers the tire tracks that pressed a crooked question into the mud. When the recovery team arrives, the world narrows to a human chain of care. One gloved hand passing to another, voices careful, movements slow. A detective kneels. A medic glances at the clock without meaning to. Time feels like something that might still be negotiated. The name comes quietly at first, then gathers force as it moves outward, as it lands in the group chat, in the newsroom, in the prayers spoken aloud in a living room, where the couch cushions have been dented by months of waiting. 3 syllables that suddenly must hold too much. A person, a headline, a fear confirmed. 3 months of looking now collapse into a moment of finding, and the weight of that truth drags the breath from anyone who loved her. The pond is not just a pond anymore. It's a clock that stopped. It's a secret that failed. It's evidence. But water does not tell a story alone. People do. The ones who searched when the cold made their fingers numb. The ones who wrote her name on poster board and taped it to lampposts that sweated in summer and froze in winter. The ones who refused to accept "maybe she left" as an answer, because they knew the shape of her habits, the way she always texted back, the laugh that made other people laugh just to keep up. The community that knew her, and the community that didn't but knows what it is to be overlooked, begin to speak with one voice. They say her name. They say it again. They say it because the world tends to lower its eyes when it should look harder. They say it because justice doesn't arrive on its own. It is summoned. It is demanded. It is worked for. And under the pressure of that demand, the stillness begins to crack. Threads appear, a digital breadcrumb in a chat log, a door that wasn't locked as tightly as someone hoped it was, a neighbor who remembers a time, a sound, a face, a ride that started as a promise and ended as a lie. We will follow those threads one by one without looking away. We will name what happened in that room and how the road to this pond was paved by choices, by prejudice, by a sudden storm of violence. We will ask why it took 3 months for the water to speak when so many were shouting above it. We will sit with the uncomfortable truths about who is believed, who is protected, and who is left to walk home alone. We begin with the pond because that is where the silence broke. But this is not where CeCe's story ends. It cannot be. There is more to say, more to learn, more to correct. The person she was deserves the fullness of a life remembered, not only the horror of a life taken. The community that loved her deserves answers that fit, consequences that hold, a justice that isn't just a headline, but a change in how we all listen when someone goes missing. In quiet Olmsted Township, a body rose from still water, tied to a block of concrete. 3 months of questions floated up with her name. CeCe Dove, buried in silence. She was missing. They found her 3 months later. But the truth would only surface after the community demanded justice. And when it did, it would ripple far beyond this pond, through apartments and courtrooms, through group chats and grief circles, through every place where a person like CeCe is asked to be small just to be safe. Say her name with us. Hold it, keep it. Let it be louder than the water, louder than the wind, louder than the fear that keeps people quiet. Semia, CeCe Dove, was 20 years old, young enough to still be collecting firsts, old enough to have already learned the cost of living as her true self. She moved through life with a smile that could soften strangers, but also with a guardedness born from knowing that not everyone saw her the way she saw herself. In Cleveland, she was known among friends for her style, her humor, and the way she refused to let people forget who she was. She lived with her mother, Martha Akoff, a woman whose love for her daughter was the kind that could be felt across a room. She shared a special bond with her mother, a relationship built on trust, late-night talks, and the kind of unconditional love that can only be forged through years of standing by each other. With her siblings, CeCe was the protective one, the kind who would step in to defend them without hesitation. Martha had watched CeCe grow into her identity with pride, but also with worry, aware that being a young, black transgender woman meant facing a world that could be as dangerous as it was beautiful. To Martha, CeCe wasn't just her child. She was her friend, her confidant, the person who filled their home with warmth and late-night conversations. March 27, 2013, began without warning. CeCe left home, telling her mother she was meeting someone. It was an ordinary enough moment in a life full of them. No alarm bells, no clear reason to think this night would be different. But by the next morning, there was silence. No return, no call, no text that said, "I'm fine." Martha tried not to panic. People lose track of time. Plans change. But something in her bones told her that this absence was not an accident. The hours turned into days, days into weeks. Cleveland police opened a missing persons case, but with no signs of foul play in the beginning, it was hard to know where to start. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, checked hospitals, and tried to trace CeCe's movements through phone records. But in a city with thousands of missing person reports each year, hers became one among many, a reality that haunted her family. Local trans advocacy groups began to take notice. They had seen this pattern before, trans women of color disappearing without the urgency their cases deserved. Members of these groups reached out to Martha, offering not just sympathy, but boots on the ground, organizing searches, circulating CeCe's picture, and amplifying her story through social media. Martha clung to hope, but each unanswered call chipped away at the belief that her daughter was still out there. Then April 17, 2013, 3 weeks after she vanished, a call came in to Olmsted Township Police. A property owner reported something strange in the pond behind his home. Officers arrived expecting maybe debris, maybe an abandoned object caught in the reeds. But what they found was human. The recovery was grim. CeCe's body, submerged and weighed down by a block of concrete and a steel pipe. She was nude from the waist down. She had been stabbed multiple times. This was not a random drowning. This was a killing, brutal, deliberate. News traveled fast, through police channels, into the press, and finally into Martha's living room, where the words hit like a blow. A mother's worst fear had taken shape. No more waiting, no more wondering. The silence was over, but the truth it revealed was unbearable. Detectives now had to untangle what happened between the moment CeCe walked out her front door and the moment her body was pulled from the water. They interviewed friends, combed through her phone records, tracked her last known movements, but every new lead only seemed to raise more questions. Who had lured her out that night? Why this level of violence? And what was the killer trying to hide beneath all that weight? In the background, advocacy groups refused to let CeCe's case fade. They pressed the police for answers, held vigils, and demanded that her death be treated with the same urgency as any other. In the weeks that followed, her name became a rallying cry, not just for justice in her case, but for all the trans women whose stories ended too soon and too quietly. But it wasn't until a hidden connection from the past came to light, one buried deep in CeCe's personal life, that investigators saw the outline of something more sinister. On the afternoon of March the 27th, 2013, CeCe Dove had plans. They weren't unusual, nothing that would stand out to someone who didn't know her. She told a friend she was meeting a man she'd been chatting with online. He'd invited her over to his apartment. The arrangement was set. She would take a ride to an apartment complex in Olmsted Township, a quiet suburb about 20 miles west of Cleveland. The rideshare driver remembered her hair styled just so, her voice polite but confident. He dropped her off at the address just after noon. She stepped out, phone in hand, heading toward the building's entrance. The driver watched her disappear inside. That was the last confirmed sighting of CeCe Dove alive. Hours passed, then days. Friends and family called her phone, no answer. They sent messages, no reply. For Martha Akoff, every hour felt heavier. She kept replaying that morning in her head. CeCe leaving with her purse, her casual, "I'll see you later, Mom." But later never came. The Cleveland Police Missing Persons Unit began their standard protocol. Interviews, database checks, a search of local hospitals. But without clear signs of foul play, resources were thin, and the urgency that Martha felt didn't seem to translate to the system meant to protect her daughter. Then came April 17th. 3 weeks of silence suddenly interrupted. It was late morning when a man named Jeffrey Bland, a resident of Cook Road in Olmsted Township, noticed something strange floating in the pond behind his home. At first glance, he dismissed it. From his window, it looked like debris. Maybe a bag of leaves or a piece of trash caught in the water. The pond was no stranger to litter blown in from the road. But as the day wore on, the object didn't drift away. It stayed anchored, unnervingly still. When Bland walked closer, curiosity shifted into dread. The outline was wrong. Too large, too human. He called 911. Within minutes, Olmsted Township police were on the scene, securing the area with yellow tape. A recovery team waded into the cold, murky water. The closer they got, the clearer it became. This wasn't debris. It was a body. What they pulled from the pond was horrifying. The victim was tied to a large concrete block and a length of steel pipe, deliberately weighed down to keep her hidden. She was nude from the waist down. Multiple stab wounds covered her body. The water had slowed the clock, but it hadn't erased the violence. This was no accident, no spur-of-the-moment fight. This was an execution in miniature. Planned, concealed, left for nature to hide. For Martha, the phone call that followed shattered her world. Detectives told her they had found a body matching CeCe's description. DNA confirmation would come later, but Martha didn't need science to tell her what her heart already knew. The silence of the past 3 weeks was over, replaced by a howl of grief that could not be contained. For the community, particularly Cleveland's Black and transgender residents, the discovery struck a deeper chord. It was a familiar horror. Another trans woman's life violently taken, another case that might have been ignored had the evidence not literally surfaced. The whispers at vigils turned into demands for justice. CeCe's name began to travel, on flyers and news headlines, in voices that would not be quieted. And yet, even in the grief, questions sharpened. Who had CeCe met that day? Why had she been lured to that apartment? What happened in the hours after she walked through that door? Detectives began pulling threads, phone records, online chat logs, surveillance from the apartment complex. But it wasn't until they stumbled across a link buried deep in CeCe's personal connections, a tie to someone with a violent past, that the outline of something far darker began to emerge. When the pond in Olmsted Township surrendered its secret, law enforcement knew 2 things instantly. Someone had wanted CeCe Dove to disappear forever, and someone had taken deliberate steps to make sure she stayed gone. The scene was grim and methodical in its cruelty. Her body was submerged, tethered by heavy rope to a cinder block and a length of steel pipe, makeshift anchors meant to keep her from ever surfacing. The water was cold enough to slow decomposition, but not enough to erase the truth her body carried. Multiple stab wounds carved into her torso. Bruising along her arms, defensive in nature, spoke of a struggle. She was nude from the waist down, a detail that whispered of a sexual component to the violence, though investigators were careful not to speculate too soon. Even before the forensic reports came back, the investigation faced an additional layer of injustice. The first local news bulletins misgendered CeCe, using her legal name and referring to her as male. It was a stark reminder of the biases that linger in the very institutions meant to inform the public. Biases that can color perception, dull empathy, and reduce a life to something less than it was. For her family, hearing her misnamed in the media was like losing her all over again. Advocacy groups quickly stepped in, correcting the record and demanding respect for her identity. 3 weeks had passed between the moment CeCe vanished on March 27th and the day her body was discovered on April 17th. In that time, the trail had cooled, but not gone cold. Detectives from Olmsted Township in Cleveland pooled resources, starting with the last known digital breadcrumbs. CeCe's phone records told part of the story. On the day she disappeared, she exchanged messages with a man named Andrae Bridges, arranging to meet at his apartment complex. Bridges wasn't an unknown name to law enforcement. He had a criminal history, convicted in 2001 for attempted murder after stabbing a man in the chest during an argument. He served prison time and was released years later, but the violence in his past lingered like a shadow. Investigators subpoenaed Bridges' phone records and quickly found troubling overlaps. Cell tower data placed him and CeCe in the same area on the day she disappeared. Witness statements from the apartment complex painted a timeline. CeCe was seen arriving. Neighbors later reported loud noises and what they thought might have been a heated argument. After that, nothing. A search warrant for Bridges' apartment revealed traces of blood in multiple locations. Forensics confirmed the blood matched CeCe's DNA. Fibers from her clothing were found on his furniture. And in the trunk of his car, police recovered rope and materials consistent with those used to bind her body. The rope was particularly damning. Its weave, fibers, and fraying matched exactly to the lengths pulled from the pond. It wasn't just similar, it was the same rope. By now, the case was closing in around Bridges. Detectives also learned that after March 27, his behavior shifted. Friends described him as jumpy, avoiding certain topics, and making sudden changes to his routines. Most telling, his cell phone went dark for a critical window of hours on the day CeCe vanished, only to power back on later that night. It was a mosaic of evidence, digital, physical, testimonial, that gave the investigators their man. But it also revealed something darker than a single act of violence. CeCe's death was not just the work of one man's rage. It lived at the intersection of systemic failures, a society slow to protect trans women, a media landscape that stripped her identity in death, and a justice system that had once released a man with a proven capacity for lethal violence back into the world without sufficient oversight. As the arrest warrant for Andrae Bridges was signed, detectives knew the story wasn't just about closing a case file. It was about forcing a community to confront the question they had been avoiding. How many warnings have to be ignored before a tragedy like this becomes inevitable? And yet, even with Bridges in custody, the investigation wasn't over. There were still unanswered questions about motive, about what exactly happened in those final hours, and about whether the violence CeCe endured was driven by something even more calculated than rage. Those answers would come, but they would also uncover a side of this case that made even seasoned detectives stop in their tracks. By late April 2013, investigators had a name, a face, and a trail of evidence that led directly to one man, Andrae Bridges, 36 years old, from Parma, Ohio. The more they uncovered about him, the more dangerous he appeared. His record was not just stained with violence, it was soaked in it. In 2001, he'd been convicted of attempted murder for stabbing a man in the chest. He'd also served time for other violent offenses. And buried within CeCe Dove's own circle was an even darker detail. Friends later revealed that Bridges had beaten CeCe before. This was not a stranger. This was a man she knew. Detectives had more than a suspect. They had probable cause. The digital footprints were damning. Cell tower pings, placing him with CeCe on the day she vanished. The rope from his car matching that used to weigh her down. And the blood in his apartment tying him directly to the killing. But Bridges had vanished. When police went to his last known address in Parma, he was gone. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in days. His phone was off. Detectives suspected he was running. And so, the search widened. That's when the FBI Fugitive Task Force was called in. This wasn't just about finding a man, it was about locating someone capable of extreme violence before he struck again. Agents tracked financial activity, monitored known associates, and followed tips. They discovered Bridges had been bouncing between acquaintances' homes, avoiding any place where he could be easily spotted. But no one can disappear completely. On May 3rd, 2013, just over a month after CeCe's body was found, the net closed. Acting on a lead, the fugitive task force moved in on a location in Cleveland where Bridges was believed to be hiding. The arrest was quick but tense. Armed agents surrounded the building, calling for him to come out. For several long minutes, there was nothing. Then a door creaked open. Bridges emerged, his hands reluctantly raised. The manhunt was over. Bridges was booked into the Cuyahoga County Jail. The charges read like a catalog of brutality: aggravated murder, felonious assault, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. Each one carried years, if not life, behind bars. Together, they painted a picture of a crime so violent and so deliberate that prosecutors made their intentions clear from the start. They would seek the maximum penalty. The trial drew attention from both local and national media, not only because of the brutality of the killing, but because of the glaring failures that surrounded it. In court, the prosecution laid out the chain of evidence: phone records tracing CeCe to Bridges' apartment, the rope and steel pipe found in the pond, the matching fibers in his car, the blood on his walls, and the fact that he had fled the area immediately after her disappearance. Witnesses testified about the sound of an argument in his apartment the day CeCe vanished. Forensic experts described the precision and deliberation of the binding used to anchor her body. Friends of CeCe spoke about her fear of Bridges after a previous assault, fear that now felt like a warning, unheeded. But the defense attempted to undermine the case, suggesting gaps in the timeline and questioning witness reliability. They tried to frame the death as a fight gone too far, not premeditated murder. Yet the physical evidence told a different story, one of planning, concealment, and the systematic erasure of a victim's existence. Throughout the trial, local advocacy groups sat in the gallery, holding signs and wearing shirts with CeCe's name. They weren't just there for her, they were there for every trans woman whose case had been mishandled, whose name had been erased in police reports, whose killer had walked free. The jury deliberated less than a day. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all major counts. When the sentence was read, life in prison without the possibility of parole, there was no celebration, only a quiet, exhausted release. Justice had been served in the narrowest sense, but the cost was too great, the lesson too bitter. Andrae Bridges would never walk free again. But for Martha Akoff, no prison sentence could restore her daughter's laughter, her dreams, or the simple promise of her return. The trial ended, the headlines faded. Yet CeCe's story, in the fight for the dignity she was denied, was only just beginning. The courtroom was silent when the jury filed back in. Days of testimony, hours of forensic detail, and weeks of grief condensed into a single moment. Everyone knew what the stakes were. Everyone knew what the evidence had shown. When the four-person stood, the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Guilty on all major charges: aggravated murder, kidnapping, felonious assault, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. Each word landed like a hammer. For Martha Akoff, the verdict was a confirmation of what she'd known since the day the police came to her door. Her daughter's death had not been an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of violence. She wept quietly, a mother's grief softened only by the knowledge that her child's killer would face the consequences. The sentencing came swiftly. The judge's tone was stern, deliberate. 15 years to life for the murder of CeCe Dove, plus additional years for tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. In total, Andrae Bridges would serve a minimum of 18.5 years before he could even ask for parole. There was no outburst from Bridges, no apology, no admission, just the mechanical shuffle of a man being led from the courtroom in chains. Outside, the weight of the verdict spilled into the streets. Friends, family, and advocates gathered for a candlelight vigil. The glow of dozens of small flames reflected off tear-streaked faces. People spoke her name, CeCe Dove, into the cold Ohio night, their voices rising together in defiance of the silence that had followed her disappearance. For Cleveland's LGBTQ+ community, especially Black trans women, the sentencing was a moment of closure, but not victory. They knew one conviction wouldn't dismantle the crisis they faced. CeCe's death was part of a broader epidemic of violence against transgender women of color. Violence that too often goes unsolved, unnoticed, or unnamed. Advocacy groups use the moment to call for more. Better protections for trans women, stronger hate crime enforcement, and mandatory sensitivity training for law enforcement and media to prevent the kind of misgendering that marred the earliest reports of CeCe's death. They spoke about the need for change not just in the courts, but in the culture, a change that would make it possible for a young woman like CeCe to walk into a meeting with a man and come home alive. In the weeks that followed, vigils became memorials. Memorials became community meetings, and CeCe's name became part of a litany, spoken alongside those of other women lost to similar violence. Her story traveled far beyond Cleveland, appearing in national conversations about trans rights, racial justice, and gender-based violence. Yet for Martha, the aftermath was quieter. She returned to a home where her daughter's laughter no longer echoed down the hall, where her phone sat on the nightstand without new messages, where the simple act of setting 2 cups on the table in the morning felt impossibly heavy. The law had done its part. The man responsible would pay with years of his life. But the work of honoring CeCe, of ensuring her story stood for more than tragedy, was just beginning. And for those who lit candles that night, and for those who carried her name into every fight for justice that followed, the flame had only just been lit. In the months after the verdict, the streets of Cleveland carried CeCe Dove's name like a quiet drumbeat. Vigils turned to rallies and rallies to marches, each one a reminder that while justice had been served in a courtroom, the larger battle remained. But as candles cooled into puddles of wax and signs were stacked in closets, a harder truth settled in. CeCe's death was not an outlier. It was part of a chain, one link in a pattern stretching across the country, binding together the names of transgender women of color whose lives ended violently, whose cases too often went unsolved or unreported. The misgendering of CeCe in early media coverage still stung. In those first reports, her identity was stripped away, her life reduced to the wrong name, the wrong pronouns. To those who knew her, it was an erasure as cruel as the crime itself. It wasn't just sloppy reporting, it was a symptom of something deeper. Misgendering in public records and press releases has real consequences. It can confuse investigations, hinder public awareness, and strip victims of the dignity they deserve in death. Advocacy groups called it out for what it was: media bias born from systemic neglect. They demanded more than corrections. They demanded a shift in the way stories like CeCe's are told, so that no victim's truth would be buried twice. The deeper you look, the more unsettling the questions become. Was CeCe's killing an isolated act of personal violence, or was it part of a broader epidemic of transphobic crime? How many cases like hers vanish into police files labeled cold because no one with power sees urgency in solving them? How many families sit in living rooms like Martha Koff's, waiting for a phone call that will never come? April 2013, the month CeCe's body was pulled from that pond, was not an anomaly. Across the U.S., reports surfaced of other trans women killed under suspicious circumstances. Their names appeared briefly in local papers, often misgendered, often reduced to unidentified male or victim with male birth name, and then vanished from the news cycle. The repetition is its own kind of violence. The disappearance, the silence, the forgetting. In Cleveland, CeCe's name became shorthand for a demand that the lives of trans women of color be valued, protected, and remembered, not only when a killer is brought to trial, but in every policy meeting, every newsroom, every patrol car. For some, the verdict in Andrae Bridges' case was proof that the system can work. For others, it was proof of how rarely it does. Because if not for a body surfacing in that pond, if not for a neighbor's curiosity, if not for community pressure, CeCe's name might have been lost to the statistics, buried beneath layers of bias and bureaucracy. Justice in this case was measured in years of a man's life taken away. But justice for CeCe Dove, real justice, would mean dismantling the structures that made her so vulnerable in the first place. It would mean a world where her last walk to that apartment complex never happened because she never had to fear being who she was. And so her story lingers, not as a closed chapter, but as a call to vigilance. For every name spoken at a vigil, for every march down a rain-slicked street, for every headline corrected, there are still countless others we do not yet know. Her life mattered, and so do theirs. Weighted down beneath cold water and concrete, her story almost never reached the surface. For 3 long weeks, the pond in Olmsted Township kept its secret, a secret of steel and stone and unthinkable cruelty. And when the ripples finally broke, the truth that emerged was more than a single tragedy. It was a mirror, reflecting back a society that too often looks away. CeCe Dove's voice had been muted in life, misunderstood, misrepresented, mislabeled, and even in death they tried to silence her again. But voices don't vanish. They echo. They swell. And today her name is spoken not just in Cleveland, not just in Ohio, but in every place where someone knows what it means to live in the crosshairs of prejudice. Her mother, Martha Akoff, still remembers the last time she saw her daughter, the hope in her eyes, the stubborn way she wouldn't hide who she was. For Martha, CeCe is more than a victim. She is a symbol of courage and truth in a world that punishes both. For the community, her story is a rallying cry. We can measure justice by court verdicts and prison sentences. But there's another kind of justice, one not handed down by a judge, but built word by word, action by action. The justice of remembrance, the justice of saying her name without hesitation. And so we stand at the edge of that pond, figuratively and literally, looking into the still water. Behind us, the noise of a trial fades. Ahead of us, the long, unfinished work of change. She was buried in silence. May we speak her name loudly, because silence protects no one, and memory, fierce, unflinching memory, is the only thing that keeps the next name from being added to the list. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, a stranger, or a community unwilling to forget. We'll uncover what happens when ordinary people refuse to let a case fade into the shadows, and how that refusal can change everything. CeCe Dove's life was cut short in silence, but her story must never be forgotten. Too many voices like hers are buried before they are heard. If this story moved you, help keep her memory alive, share her name, speak her truth, and stand against violence. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and join us as we uncover more stories that deserve to be told.